Morning. It's good to see you this morning. Take your Bible and turn to the book of Mark. Mark chapter 5. We'll actually be sort of bouncing back and forth a little bit between Matthew 8, Mark 5, and Luke 8 this morning. We're dealing with biblical questions that various ones have asked over the last several years, actually. And among these is a question that comes out of Matthew 8, Mark 5, and Luke 8, because you have what appear to be parallel accounts here. And what this appears to be in these chapters is a parallel account of demon possession or evil spirits. One of the most vivid, most graphic accounts of casting out evil spirits or demons anywhere in the scriptures. Now, by way of background, one of the most important things that these three accounts show us is that when the scriptures speak of evil spirits or demon possession or anything of that basic character, the Bible is not describing insanity. You know, there are people in our world who are insane, whose minds do not work properly, who don't behave normally, what we recognize as normal behavior. And the Bible is not describing insanity by ascribing it to evil spirits. This is not a natural phenomenon. This is not someone having, for instance, an epileptic seizure. Although there have been those who have suggested through the years that that's all this is, just purely a naturalistic explanation. But we look at the record here, all three accounts of it, and it shows that that's not what's going on here. The records, Matthew 8, Mark 5, Luke 8, also show us the value of an individual soul. Jesus prizes one human soul above an enormous financial value, an enormous financial investment. In the context, Mark chapter 5 is where we'll spend the most of our time. In the context, you have a herd of pigs, a herd of swine, about 2,000, which is a large herd even by modern standards. Now, a little bit of background here. In Matthew's record, in Matthew chapter 8, Jesus had only very recently completed what we call the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. And he had passed through the city of Capernaum, which is on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee. He healed a centurion's servant, a Roman soldier's servant, while he was there. He healed Peter's mother-in-law there in verses 1 through 15 in Matthew chapter 5. And notice in Matthew 8 rather, in Matthew 8 verses 16 and 17, while he's there in Galilee, in the region of Capernaum, so we're in Jewish territory, he also casts out demons and heals many other people right there. So what we're about to look at later on in Matthew 8 and in Mark 5 and in Luke 8 is not an isolated incident, but it's the most vivid record of such an incident that we have in the scriptures. After these things take place, Jesus and his disciples get in a boat and they sail across the Sea of Galilee. So as we move along, Matthew 8, Mark 5, Luke 8, the first thing we're going to encounter is a question, where did Jesus go? Well, you're going to find that there are two or three different names given for the places that Jesus went. Went to the land of the Gergesenes, some translations say. He went to the land of the Gadarenes, some say. And some say the Gerasenes. And that's what you find in the American Standard, the English Standard, most of the newer English translations. The older translations, King James, New King James, the Douay Rhymes and so forth, use the word Gergesenes. And Gadarenes is found in pretty much all of them at one point or another. So, where did Jesus and his disciples actually go? These three names all sound sort of similar, but in point of fact, they're not. So why is there a difference in the locations in Matthew and Mark and Luke's accounts? Why did they not all say exactly the same thing? Well, let's look at the map. Now, this is not a very large map, but it's adequate, I think, for our purposes. If you look right here, you have the Sea of Galilee, that spot there. The Jordan River flows down through the rift here. And down here below the screen, you would have what would be the Dead Sea and Jerusalem and Judea off to the left of that area. The Sea of Galilee there at the top of that map is about 13 miles long, 12 to 13 miles long from north to south. It's roughly about 8 miles, 7.5 to 8 miles wide at its widest point. As you can see, it's sort of kidney shaped or almost kind of diamond shaped. It is quite deep, and it is below sea. The Dead Sea is below sea level. This is not, but this is quite deep, surrounded on three sides by mountains, and then some plains running down to it from the east side. Famous for violent storms. We would call it a large lake. They sail across from west to east, and they come to the land of take your pick, Gergesenes, Gadarenes, Gerasenes. Now, explanations. Cursa, or Gergesa, ancient Gergesa, is a city, or a town really, that is right on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. And in fact, it's actually just across the border in the territory that is typically called Gaulonitis in the Roman times. Gadara, which you see there, down below that, Gadara was actually the commercial center of the region called the Decapolis. The Decapolitan region was a city, a region rather, of actually originally 10 cities that were established by Alexander the Great about 340 years before the birth of Jesus, for the purpose of trying to plant Greek culture and Greek philosophy and Greek religion and Greek politics in this area. That also explains why there's somebody keeping a large herd of pigs in this area. Jews would have nothing to do with that. But not everybody in the Decapolis was Jewish. But then come down a little more south and you come to Gerasa, which is actually the nominal capital of this region called the Decapolis. If something happens in Fayetteville, does it happen in Fayette County? Yeah. If something happens in Fayetteville in Fayette County, does it happen in the state of Georgia? Okay. Now follow along here. Matthew is writing to a very detail-oriented audience. Who is the target audience for Matthew's writing? Typically, we understand it to be Jews. And so we come over here to Matthew chapter 8, and at verse 28, when he had come to the other side, to the country of the what? What does your translation say? Gergesenes. Okay. King James, New King James, Douay Rhymes, typically will say Gergesenes. Modern speech translations generally say Gadarenes. Well, where do you live? If you're trying to describe to someone who's not from Georgia where you live, where do you tell them you live? Atlanta. How many of us actually live in Atlanta, Georgia? There's not a one of us in here. Why do we say Atlanta? Folks generally know where Atlanta is. Did you know I have a preacher friend who preaches in Atlanta? Not Atlanta, Georgia. He preaches in Atlanta, Texas. Did you know there is an Atlanta, Texas? It's Jim Garner knew that. Leave it to an airline guy. Atlanta, Texas it's slightly larger than a fly speck on the map. Atlanta, Georgia, on the other hand, is a major metropolitan area with the world's biggest, busiest airport. If you're going anywhere on Delta, where are you going first? Atlanta. In the same way, many of the people who read these accounts in the first century, in ancient times, might not know where Gergesa is. Jews might know, but those to whom Mark and Luke are writing, or for whom they're writing, are probably not going to know that. Gadara is the major city of that area, and it's 16 miles south and just slightly east of Gergesa. So if you say the land of the Gadarenes, it's a little bit like saying the land of the Atlantans. Folks know where Atlanta is. But then we have this other title, Gerasa. Well, Gerasa is the capital of the region. The Greeks might well be aware of that. Here's the point. Depending on the translation from which you're reading, some of the newer English translations are actually consistent in all three accounts in using the term Gerasenes, referring to Gerasa, or Gergesenes rather, referring to Gergesa. But if you're reading from the King James, the New King James, the Douay Rhymes, any of the older translations that are based on the Textus Receptus, you'll find different descriptions based on the people's understanding of the territory. Now, the manuscripts, the older Greek manuscripts that have Gadarenes, most important city, most recognizable, Atlanta. Those that refer to the Gerasenes, well, that's the official territory, the land based on the capital. Matthew, in Matthew chapter 8, describes a region. It's a little bit like saying Fayette County rather than Fayetteville. What all three records have in common is that they place the events that take place right on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Now, just about 5 miles, 6 miles south of here is Lake Horton. Some of you maybe have never even been to Lake Horton. Pretty little place. Nice little park there. Something that takes place on the shore of Lake Horton takes place near Fayetteville. Fayetteville's the nearest town, basically, of any recognizable size. Something that takes place on the shore of Lake Horton takes place in Fayette County. Takes place in the region of Atlanta. That's what we have going on here in Matthew 8, Mark 5, and Luke 8. So, how many people did Jesus heal in this area? Take your Bible and turn first to Matthew chapter 8 and start reading with me at verse 28. Now, I'm reading from the English Standard Version, so it uses the term Gadarenes to describe the territory. When he came to the other side, that's the other side of the Sea of Galilee, to the country of the Gadarenes, 2 demon-possessed men met him coming out of the tombs, so fierce that no one could pass that way. And behold, they cried out, "What have you to do with us, O Son of God? Why have you come here to torment us before the time?" Now a herd of many pigs was feeding at some distance from them, and the demons begged him, saying, "If you cast us out, send us away into the herd of pigs." And he said to them, "Go." And they came out and went into the pigs. And behold, the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the waters. The herdsmen fled. Going into the city, they told everything, especially what had happened to the demon-possessed men. And behold, all the city came out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they begged him to leave their region. Now come over to Mark chapter 5. And this takes place at the beginning of Mark chapter 5. Starting at verse 1, they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he'd often been bound with shackles and chains, but he had wrenched the chains apart and broke the shackles in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country, and the people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs, and they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. Now, you go over to Luke chapter 8, and in Luke chapter 8, this begins at verse 26, and Luke largely parallels Mark. They sailed to the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. Jesus stepped out on the land. There met him a man from the city who had demons. For a long time he'd worn no clothes. He had not lived in a house but among the tombs. And pretty well it follows Mark's account at that point. How many people, how many men, how many demon-possessed men did Jesus heal? Matthew clearly says 2. Mark and Luke mention only 1. Well, some would say 3, except it's clear that the man mentioned in Mark and Luke seems to be one of the two mentioned in Matthew. So why does Matthew mention two and Mark and Luke mention only one? Okay, there is mention of only one speaking, or seemingly. But you look at the distinction here. Two. A man. A certain man, a specific man. Luke is quite emphatic. A specific man. That tells us something about at least one of the men. In fact, what does Luke tell us about him? Somebody had tried to chain him up. Somebody had tried to restrain him and he had not been able. He'd been chained, he'd been shackled, he'd broken the chains, broken the shackles. Have you ever seen somebody break a chain with their own physical strength? That's pretty amazing, isn't it? Small chain, maybe. Could be. Let's pursue that for just a second. Take a swing set chain. You know how a swing set chain is made. It's the links are basically 1/8 inch galvanized steel wire, folded and twisted. And you put enough of these together, you have a swing set chain, and you connect them to the swing set or to the ceiling of the porch or to the branch of the tree, and you put a seat on it, and Junior gets on it and swings. How much weight can that swing support? Any of you want to admit to ever having sat on it as an adult? Yeah. And it didn't collapse, did it? It can support a couple 100 pounds. Now go to a public playground. I realize now that public playgrounds with slides and merry-go-rounds and monkey bars and the climbing dome things that we used to play on, those are a thing of the past. Occasionally you still find a swing set though. What kind of chain do they use on that swing? Or on school ground swings, if they still have such? They use welded chain links. They don't use that twisted wire. Why not? It's stronger, it's more durable, and there's the issue of liability. Here's the point. Even if it's just a comparatively lightweight residential children's swing set chain, do you think you could break that? Do what? Well, yeah, maybe with a car, but just trying to break loose of it? Probably not. In fact, what do police officers and law enforcement officers carry as backup for their handcuffs in case they need more than one pair of handcuffs? Zip ties. Have you ever tried to break a zip tie? Did you succeed? You know, the only time a zip tie breaks normally is when the little tab that makes it zip flips backwards inside its little buckle, and that takes a lot of force if it's a very big zip tie. Here's my point. This man did something that was notable to all the people around. It was extraordinary that he could break free of those chains and the shackles with which he'd been shackled. So, a certain man, a well-known local figure. Luke is highlighting somebody that everybody would recognize in the area. As you drive up Highway 314, going north of Fayetteville, just as you get this side of State Road 138, on the right is a Catholic high school, and what's on the left? Not then, now. Okay, it used to be Evander Holyfield's house. Great big 100 and some acres and long wall, lights on it at night, wrought iron and brick, and the whole place is lit up like an airport. Mention where Evander Holyfield used to live, and many, if not most, residents of Fayette County and a lot of Clayton County folks and some from Coweta, people that live in this general area, they know where you're talking about. It's a notable location. Anybody know who lives there now? There you go, some singer. Rick Ross, if memory serves me. Well, that location is, I don't want to say notorious, but it's notable. It's well known to local folks, even those of us who don't live in that immediate area. This man was clearly well known in his area. You hear about a man who can break chains, word gets around, doesn't it? And you read the description of him, screaming and crying out, cutting himself. Those are not things that you would think would go with that kind of strength. So, why the difference in Numbers 2 versus 1? Well, 3 people? Maybe, but 2 of them seem to be the same one. Matthew is writing, as we generally understand it, for a Jewish audience. And Jews, among other things, were very detail-oriented. Matthew mentions 2 men because anybody following up, you might say, trying to verify, would learn what? Well, there were 2 demon-possessed men here. Bear in mind, though, Jesus had just crossed the Sea of Galilee from the region of Capernaum, and what had he done in and around Capernaum while he was there after he healed Peter's mother-in-law? Go back to Matthew chapter 8, look at verses 15 and 16. He'd healed a bunch of people who were what? Possessed by evil spirits, possessed by demons. So, the fact of being cured or healed or having evil spirits cast out, that was not the notable thing for the Jewish reader. But the details, what kind of demons or how many were there, how many people were healed, that they paid attention to. Mark and Luke, Mark writing seemingly for the hurry up and get to the point Roman mindset, and Luke writing for the Greek philosophical perspective, they're giving us the basic facts. Here's what took place, generally speaking. Here's where it happened relatively in this area. And that's the point as far as they are concerned. Why not mention both men in all 3 records? Well, it's not the focus of the event. One man, at least, lived in the tombs. Now, a little bit of background. That area, go back to that map. Let me find that map. There we go. That area on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, the shore does descend rather steeply. And that whole area is honeycombed with limestone cliffs and the limestone shore. And if you know anything about limestone, it's a very soft stone compared to the granite that we have around here. And for centuries, literally for thousands of years, people there have been digging and burrowing into the limestone to cut out graves and tombs and mausoleums and so forth in which to bury their dead. The ancient Jews did not bury as we do, where we dig a hole and put a box in it and put the body in the box and then cover it up with dirt. They put the body wrapped in clothing, wrapped in cloth, embalmed with spices, basically on a shelf in a mausoleum or a tomb, a hole bored or cut into the side of a cliff or a stone wall, and then they closed the door on it basically and let it dry up. And when everything had dried, then somebody would go in there and gather up the bones and put them in a comparatively small box. And that might be buried, literally put in the ground and covered up, or it might simply be stacked at the back of the mausoleum to free up that shelf for the next person that died. Regardless, for the Jews, being around the tombs, being around the cemetery, handling things that had died, not just people, but even animals that had died, made one unclean. So the Jews did not typically have cemetery cleanup days and cemetery decoration days and so forth like many of our people do. Because if you go there and you're in that area, you're going to be defiled. You're going to be considered unclean. So this man or these men, the notable one at any rate, living in and around the tombs, is somebody that these people are not, the Jewish people at any rate, are not going to want to associate with. Why 1 versus 2 in Mark and Luke? The common explanation is that one was more notable, more violent, more dominant, more noteworthy than the other. For what it's worth, Mark and Luke do not tell us there was only one there. They mention the one that stands out. But consider this. Where do these events take place? What's the region? Go back to Mark chapter 5 and verse 1. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. In Luke chapter 8, what do you read at verse 26? They sailed to the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. They crossed the Sea of Galilee. Go back to Matthew chapter 8, and you look at verse 28. They came to the other side, to the country of the Gadarenes. On the west and north side of the Sea of Galilee is the region, the province of Galilee. And Galilee is a Jewish province. The law there is Jewish law. The people there are Jewish people, other than those passing through for the most part. South of Galilee is Samaria. And all along the western shore, or the western bank really, of the Jordan River, from the bottom of the Sea of Galilee to almost the top of the Dead Sea, well, that's, from a Jewish perspective, that's no man's land. That's Samaritan territory. That's the area where really good Jews don't even set foot there because they'll defile themselves by going there. Jesus and his disciples go straight north and south through that territory and don't hesitate. You come to John chapter 4, Jesus talks to a Samaritan woman at the well of Sychar. And then south of Samaria is Judea with Jerusalem. But on the east side, the east bank of the Jordan, across from Samaria and across from part of Galilee, along part of the eastern bank or shore of the Sea of Galilee, is the Decapolis. And like we said a few minutes ago, the Decapolis was an area, it's ancient Manasseh's territory and ancient Ephraim and Gad in the days of Joshua. That's who was over there, had conquered that territory. It's an area that had been part of the northern kingdom that was taken away into captivity by the Assyrians in 721 BC. There had not been strong Jewish influence in that area for almost 1,000 years by the time of Jesus. That's not to say there were no Jews there. There were. But they were not the dominant influence. Gentiles were. The original 10 cities that were planted there, by the time that Jesus comes along, there are actually roughly 18 to 20 cities in that area. But the original 10 cities had been established by Alexander the Great, like I said, to introduce Greek influence. Every kind, religious, political, social, philosophical, educational, every kind of Greek influence. And to a large degree they succeeded because those cities remained there 350 years later. Most Jews would not live in that area. That explains why there's somebody there raising pigs. Jesus and his disciples going over across the Sea of Galilee to that area tells us something about his interest in those people. Just like Jesus going to the region of Tyre and Sidon over on the Mediterranean coast tells us something about how Jesus felt toward Gentiles. Just like Jesus going and talking to that Samaritan woman in John chapter 4 tells us how he felt about Samaritan people. Jesus is teaching his disciples to think differently about non-Jews, differently than they'd been taught growing up. Think about the 12 men that are with Jesus. You've got Peter, who's always ready to act first and think later. You've got James and John, the sons of thunder, that boy, if anybody crosses Jesus, do you want us to call down fire from heaven? As if they could. You've got Matthew, Levi, on the other hand, who had worked as a tax collector, seemingly for the Romans, and so he might be at least nominally more comfortable talking to and dealing with these people. But then what about Simon Zelotes, Simon the Zealot, Simon the hard right-wing revolutionary? He's given that up to become a disciple of Jesus. But do you suppose maybe it just kind of made his skin crawl a little bit to be around those people? Think about James, the brother, son of Zebedee, brother of John, one of the two willing to call down fire from heaven, one of the two who wanted to sit at the right or left hand of Jesus. Among these unclean people. And Jesus takes these men, I kind of wonder, as they're heading to shore, I don't think there are big wrought iron gates saying Gergesa Cemetery right there by the seashore, but it's going to be obvious eventually where they're about to land, right by the cemetery. These guys would not want to be anywhere close to a cemetery, because what are they at this point? They're still Jews. And to be around a cemetery, other Jews would consider them unclean, defiled. So, tombs were a place of defilement, an unclean place. In Leviticus chapter 21, the priests particularly were not to handle anything dead, really, other than sacrificial animals. They were not to handle a corpse or anything of that sort, because it would cause them to be unqualified for their priestly duties, at least until sundown. And we go over to Numbers chapter 19, and we find that the general consensus among the Jews was that if you handle something dead, especially some body dead, you're going to be unclean for 7 days. That inhibits a priest from fulfilling his priestly duties, especially if it's his turn to serve in the temple or in the tabernacle at that point. So there's an issue for these guys even being there. And then on top of that, who meets them? At least one man, and according to Matthew, 2 men who are demon-possessed, have unclean spirits. That expression, unclean, means impure, defiled. It's the same terminology that's used in the Old Testament to describe somebody, for example, who had come in contact with a dead body. They're impure. But there's a question here, if you think about it. Whose spirit was impure? As we read through Matthew 8, Mark 5, and Luke 8, what do we encounter? Mark says, a man with an unclean spirit. So the man himself is an unclean spirit. Is that what it says? No, as we read farther along, Jesus is going to cast out the spirit, or actually the multitude of unclean spirits that are in the man. Luke will tell us that after that, where's the man found? Why, he's got his clothes on again. He's not running around out here like Ray Stevens Streaker. He's in his right mind. He's sitting. He's calm. He's in control of himself, unlike before. Whose spirit was impure? It wasn't the man's spirit. It was the evil spirit that was within him. Now, bear in mind, we're talking about something here that's just, by 21st century standards, the whole idea, the whole imagery here is almost fanciful, like something out of a horror film or something. But it's not the man who is impure. He is not in control in this circumstance, or not fully so. The unclean spirit or spirits recognized Jesus as someone who could command, who could sit in judgment, who could expel them from this man. And they appeal, put us in the pigs. Now, this man's actions, while under the influence of those unclean spirits, his actions are unmistakable. When Jesus steps out of the boat, this individual these men, Matthew chapter 8, meet him. And what's the reaction? What's the response? In Matthew chapter 8, verse 29, the men are crying out, "What have you to do with us, O Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" Mark chapter 5, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." That's a bold statement. Adjure is to command or to make a demand. Don't you torment me. Well, why would he say that? Go on to verse 8. Jesus is looking at the situation and already issuing the command. Come out of that man. Leave that man alone. Whose spirit is defiled? Well, it's not the man. It's interesting to read that the man came and fell down at Jesus' feet. Seems to be some struggle within him here. But as we go on, Jesus speaks with the evil spirit. What's your name? And it's Legion, for we are many. What does legion mean? A legion describes a multitude. In this time period, a typical Roman military legion, a Roman military unit, was roughly 6,100 soldiers, footmen, accompanied by approximately 1,000 other ranks, you might say. Centurions and the commanders, about 600 to 660 cavalry, and then engineers and support personnel. Roughly 7,000 to 7,500 men. That's a legion. Is that how many evil spirits are in this man? Well, I suppose it's possible. Is this a literal or a figurative number? Probably more figurative than literal. A multitude. A lot. Jesus is commanding that the man be freed, and the evil spirits are asking, well, let us go into the pigs. And Jesus permits. He does not command. He permits that to occur. That's a big herd by any standard. And this takes us back to who dominates the Decapolis. Primarily Gentile people. Primarily idol worshiping or agnostic or maybe even some cases atheistic people, not diligent, religious observant Jews. What takes place here becomes a notable local